Welcome to session 1 of this series from Walk Through the Bible Study Simplified. Our hope, as I said in the introduction, is to inspire you to believe that you too can study the Bible on your own. And our goal is to give you a method, a process, a recipe that you can follow step by step, learning to study the Bible on your own. We're not talking so much about a devotional reading of the Bible or following a Bible reading plan and reading from Genesis to Revelation over the course of a year. We're talking about taking a specific passage of the Bible and looking at it with a lot of depth, trying to understand what does it say and what does it mean and how does it apply to my life. And the 4 sessions of this series are the 4 steps of this process, this recipe, to learn to study the Bible for yourself. The sessions read, explore, explain, apply are those 4 steps that will follow. This first session is simply to read, learning to read the Bible well. When I was a kid, I remember very distinctly this bookcase that we had in a room of our house, and on that bookcase was this multi-volume collection called an encyclopedia. I'm not even sure you can buy an encyclopedia anymore. All of the information seems to be at the end of our fingertips on a phone or a computer. But when I was a kid, if we had a paper in school and we needed some information, we would go to the encyclopedia. If we were in science class and wanted to know the lifespan of a giraffe, we would go and we'd pull the G volume off and we look up giraffe and what's the lifespan of a giraffe. And we'd have our answer and we'd close the book and we put it back on the shelf and we have the answer that we needed for our assignment. And that's how you read the encyclopedia. And unfortunately, Bible reading for a lot of us has sort of become like reading the encyclopedia or reading a reference book. We have a question. What does the Bible say about? And maybe we do an online search for Bible verses about whatever that topic is. We pull the Bible off the shelf. We go to those verses. We try to find an answer to that question. We get our answer. We close the Bible. We put it back onto the shelf. And the Bible, for a lot of us, is just sort of a reference tool to look things up, read small fragments of the Bible. But the Bible was never intended to be read like that. The Bible ultimately is a collection of books. Books of history, books of poetry, biographies, historical narratives, books that were written and intended to be read, intended to be read well. And while this course, this series is all about taking a small passage of the Bible and studying it with a lot of depth, we actually need to first invert the process. And rather than looking small at a small passage, we need to read big. We need to read the broader context of the Bible in which the passage that we want to study is found. Ideally, that's reading books. For this series, I'm going to use Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through 13 as a bit of a sample for us to follow along together as we learn this process. And so if I'm going to study Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through 13, before I do that, I'm going to read Philippians. I want to read the book in which the passage is found. Now, I recognize that if maybe you're studying a passage in Genesis, and Genesis is a much longer book than Philippians, and it might feel impractical to read Genesis multiple times before you study. But look for the broader section of the book in which your passage is found. But we want to read big, broad sections of the Bible and learn the context in which the passage is found. But as we read, we want to be able to answer some basic questions about the book that we're reading. And so I'm going to give you 6 questions as part of this first step of the process of learning to study the Bible. Here, learning to read big. And as we read, we're going to try to answer 6 pretty basic questions. You'll see them in the study guide at walkthru.org/simplified if you download that. It says, who wrote the book? When was the book written? To whom was the book written? What themes do you notice as you read? What type of literature is this? And why was the book written? Those are pretty basic questions that we'll be able to answer as we're reading through the book of the Bible in which the passage that we want to study is found. Let me show you sort of what that might look like. I want to study Philippians chapter 2. And so before I begin to focus on Philippians 2, I'm going to read this letter. I'm going to read Philippians. It's only a couple of pages in my Bible, so it's pretty easy to sit down at one time, start in chapter 1, verse 1, and read till I get all the way to the end. I'm not going to stop at chapters. I'm not going to stop at section headings. I'm not going to pay attention to any study notes that were added. I'm going to sit down and go, this was a book that was written. I want to read it, start to finish. So before I ever begin to look at Philippians 2, I'm going to read Philippians 3, 4, 5 times, maybe all in one day or over a couple of days. And as I read, I'm going to begin asking these 6 basic questions about this book and trying to understand what's happening in this book that I want to study. So here's what that looks like. I wrote, who wrote the book? I just wrote Paul and Timothy. In this case, it's super easy. Chapter 1, verse 1, Paul and Timothy. It tells us who wrote it. Now, a lot of books that you're going to study, you're not going to find the author. You're not going to see who wrote the book. And that's okay. Maybe you can look for clues that could help you try to decipher who that is, but it's not going to be clear. Here, it's super easy, Paul and Timothy. And as I read through Philippians, there were things that I noticed about Paul. He describes himself a little bit in chapter 3, so I made some notes about that. And I'm just looking for what I can about who it is that wrote this book. I would encourage you to take the study guide, the template that you can download, and make notes. Write things down. As you go through this entire series, Bible Study Simplified, you want to be taking notes and just capturing these things that you're learning as you're reading the passage. When was the book written? Well, there's no date. There's no specific date in Philippians that tells us when the book was written. But here's what I noticed. On several occasions, we're told that Paul was in prison when he wrote this. So I just made a note of all of these verses where it says Paul was in prison. I don't know the date that it was written right now, but I know that it was a time in which Paul was in prison, and that could help at least narrow the focus a little bit. To whom was it written? Well, again, Philippians, it's really easy to find that out. It says, Paul and Timothy, servants of Christ Jesus, to all of God's people in Christ Jesus at Philippi, together with the overseers and deacons. Super easy to answer in this case, God's people at Philippi. Now, other books that you'll read, you won't have a clear answer to that. But what do you notice about the people that would have been the first recipients of this book that you're reading? Just make those notes. What themes do you notice as you read? You know, as you are reading through a book over and over again, you'll see themes begin to emerge from the pages. What are things that are said over and over, repeated? What are things that you see as you are reading through the book? I wrote down just a few things: joy and suffering, encouragement of unity and community among the believers, this idea of conducting yourself worthy of the gospel. I saw that over and over again. It may sound hard or complicated at first, but it's just a simple step in this process. Read the book, and what are the things that you see thematically that emerge from the page? What type of literature is it? In this case, it's pretty easy to answer. It's a letter. It might be in other cases, it feels like it's telling history, or it's a biography, or it's poetry. Just write that down, and that's going to become important later as we get into later sessions in this series. Why was the book written? You know, it's interesting. Every one of these books in the Bible were written for a reason. The human author that wrote the book decided for some reason to write what they wrote down. So, I mean, think about Philippians. Paul and Timothy are in prison, and they decided to write a letter to these Christians in Philippi. Why? I think that's an important question to help us really understand what's happening in the life of the author, what's happening in the life of the original readers and helping us to faithfully understand the Bible in the later sessions of this series. So why was it written? So I read Philippians several times as I was studying it, and I just stopped after a few times of reading Philippians, and I just stepped back and I said, why did Paul write this? I wrote down, Paul and Timothy wrote a letter to encourage and strengthen the believers in Philippi to live and die in light of Jesus' death. That's just how I summarized it. You would summarize it differently. That's fine. But the idea is that we want to read the book in which the passage that we want to study is found, and then just sort of step back and say, why was this book written? Why did the author choose to write this? So those are our 6 questions. Who wrote the book? When was the book written? To whom was the book written? What themes do you notice? What type of literature is it? And why was it written? Those 6 questions will help us as we start this process to understand the context in which the passage that we want to study is found. Why do we do this? Why do we start this series of learning to study the Bible together with reading the book that our passage is found over and over and over again? Here's why. Because it puts us in the best position to faithfully understand the passage that we want to study. So this is session 1, step 1, read. Learning to read the Bible well. Session 2, we'll begin to look more closely at the passage that we want to study. In the second step of this process, read, explore. That's session 2. We'll see you then.